From Roswell rumors to modern radar data, UAP sightings have fueled speculation for decades. But in 2025, the landscape has shifted. Congress and oversight committees have expanded reporting requirements, created investigative bodies, and directed funding streams toward UAP study. Alongside this, the government established the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, while NASA launched its own independent UAP study team, signaling that the subject moved firmly into official channels. What drives these extraordinary steps remains uncertain. There is evidence, denials, and open questions. This video explains what is verified, what remains allegation, and why one intelligence officer now sits at the center of it. Who is David Grusch now? In 2023, David Grusch emerged as one of the most visible figures in the UAP debate, not as an anonymous source or journalist, but as a decorated intelligence officer directly stepping into the public eye. That year, he filed a whistleblower complaint through official channels, asserting that secret programs had long concealed retrieved craft and technology of non-human origin. What gave weight to this action was not only his career as a military and intelligence professional, but also the Inspector General of the intelligence community's assessment that his complaint was both credible and urgent. That judgment elevated his claims from rumor to a matter Congress could not easily ignore. At the same time, the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office repeatedly stated it had found no evidence of such crash retrieval or reverse engineering programs, presenting the public with two sharply conflicting perspectives. Grusch's standing to make such allegations rests on a resume much different from the average UFO commentator. He entered service with a background in physics, became an officer in the U.S. Air Force, and later worked as an intelligence professional tasked with analyzing scientific and technical information. In those roles, he gained clearance to handle some of the most sensitive data in government. Eventually, he became associated with the UAP task force, where his job was to assess encounters that defied conventional explanation. This positioned him uniquely. He was not a civilian gathering second-hand reports, but a government insider reviewing classified materials and testimony. For an issue long dismissed as fringe, his credentials provided a rare bridge into official territory. When he went public, the scope of his allegations quickly distinguished him from past whistleblowers. He described what he understood as a multi-decade effort to recover and reverse engineer non-human technology, with even references to so-called non-human biologics tied to these retrievals. These were and remain his allegations, statements he insists come from classified briefings and interviews with dozens of colleagues. They stretch far beyond lights in the sky or unexplained videos. They raise the possibility of physical evidence, hardware, and biological data. That scale of claim drew immediate skepticism from parts of the defense establishment and from many scientists. They argued such revelations would be nearly impossible to keep secret for decades if genuine. Still, the very fact he anchored them in sworn testimony underpinned their reach. The institutional response has been split. On one side, the Intelligence Community Inspector General formally affirmed that his underlying complaint warranted urgent review. That determination carries weight because it means his testimony was not dismissed outright within classified oversight. On the other side, AARO, the Department of Defense, and NASA all issued public statements saying they had found no trace of programs matching his descriptions. For outside observers, this creates a paradox. One arm of oversight validated the seriousness of his disclosure, while other agencies flatly rejected the substance of it. That unresolved contradiction continues to fuel debate about his reliability and about how much of the truth sits locked away in classified compartments. In the 2 years since he first testified, Grusch has remained active. He is no longer only a whistleblower on headlines. He now provides briefings and discussions with congressional staff, consults with some lawmakers, and participates in classified sessions where permitted. He does not hold a formal congressional advisory title, yet his persistence has kept him in the circle of people shaping how the issue of UAPs is debated inside government. That persistence alone is unusual. Historically, whistleblowers on topics like this have been shut out of policy, often seeing their careers end the moment they speak publicly. Grusch, in contrast, managed to transition into a semi-consultative role, with his background continuing to attract attention even as critics dispute his conclusions. For those watching his journey, what stands out is how normalized his presence has become within official debate. A subject once ridiculed as science fiction now features input from a former intelligence professional testifying under oath to recovered technology programs. Members of Congress reference his statements in hearings and cite his testimony as part of the justification for mandating further transparency. Even without a formal appointment, his willingness to brief, answer questions, and interpret the culture of secrecy surrounding UAPs makes him a figure institutions repeatedly return to. That is a significant change from a time when UFO claims were dismissed outright in Washington. Despite this, Grusch remains polarizing. Supporters highlight his stature, his access to classified reporting, and the Inspector General's credibility ruling. Skeptics emphasize the lack of verifiable physical evidence presented to the public and note the explicit denials from Pentagon and NASA investigations. To them, a single officer's allegations cannot overturn decades of official statements or substitute for direct material proof. This tension makes him both an influential and contested player, a man some see as a brave insider risking reputation, and others describe as misled or overstating. The reality is that Grusch has carved out a role no one else occupies, an intersection of insider authority and outsider controversy. He continues to appear in briefings, maintains contact with lawmakers, and shapes how oversight bodies frame the UFO discussion. At the same time, the government's most visible research bodies continue to counter his claims with their own findings. This unresolved dynamic ensures his name remains at the center of debate, while larger questions about secrecy, verification, and oversight remain unsettled. His persistence also underscores a deeper change inside the system. Congress is willing not only to hear claims like his, but fold them into hearings, legislation, and new investigative offices. This represents a departure from past decades when insiders who spoke out were more likely to face silencing and invitation. Grusch may not hold a title of congressional advisor, but his repeated briefings show officials are at least open to factoring his perspective into their oversight. That institutional willingness is as much a story as his own allegations. The path Grusch has taken, from officer to whistleblower to public witness, and now to an active voice consulted by members of Congress, illustrates not just one man's trajectory but a systemic shift in how claims about UAPs are handled. Where figures in his position were once isolated or sidelined, he is now part of the conversation shaping the government's next steps. This development sets the stage for one of the most significant factors influencing whether others will follow. Because for insiders considering whether to speak about UAP programs, the real question is no longer just whether their story will be heard, but whether they will be protected once they tell it. The biggest change: legal protections for whistleblowers. For those who consider speaking out today, the key difference compared to earlier generations is the presence of formal legal channels. This brings us to the biggest shift in recent years. Congress has begun creating explicit protections for whistleblowers willing to discuss UAP-related programs. For decades, the largest deterrent was not the content of claims, but the price paid afterward. Former officials who spoke publicly often lost their security clearances or saw once promising careers quietly end. Even in closed-door briefings, many hesitated to approach oversight committees, fearing retaliation by agencies or contractors responsible for guarding compartmented projects. The pattern was consistent. The silence was enforced not just by secrecy agreements, but by the personal and professional cost inflicted on those who chose to break them. By the early 2020s, only rare figures such as Grusch were willing to accept those burdens. That environment began to change after his testimony in 2023. Pressure built from journalists, advocacy groups, and several lawmakers who believed the system needed reform. They argued accountability suffered when insiders had no way to speak openly without destroying their careers. By late 2023 and into 2024, Congress responded by strengthening reporting procedures and embedding whistleblower-related provisions into the annual defense authorization process. Lawmakers debated language partly modeled on earlier declassification frameworks, framing new avenues for those with sensitive knowledge of UAP activity to present it to oversight channels. The legislative push did not end with a single law, but evolved across fiscal years, continuing to expand into FY 2025. The statutory outcome was not a blanket amnesty or an open press conference. Rather, Congress outlined circumstances in which whistleblowers could carry classified or otherwise restricted information into secure committee settings. Civil groups clarified this pathway, pointing out that disclosures still needed to follow specific procedures, but could now bring sensitive content into the record without automatically triggering penalties for unauthorized release. In theory, the message was clear. A contractor, scientist, or intelligence officer could approach investigators with information under formal legal cover. In practice, however, protections did not eliminate all forms of reprisal. Real-world cases still involved loss of assignments, delayed promotions, or strained professional relations, even where the law affirmed protections. The difference is that insulated channels now exist. For example, Grusch's own initial complaint was reviewed by the Intelligence Community Inspector General, who designated it both urgent and credible. That precedent made it harder for others in government to dismiss the seriousness of future disclosures. Parallel to that, nonprofit legal groups working pro bono began offering counsel to those considering testifying. Together, these changes lowered the temperature around the act of speaking up, even if they did not erase the risks entirely. Two practical takeaways emerge from this shift. First, Congress has provided clearer legal corridors that allow those with direct UAP-related knowledge to go before oversight bodies in a structured way, something almost impossible to imagine during earlier decades. Second, while those protections exist, they are still imperfect. Retaliation may be reduced, but it has not vanished, and individuals who come forward must still weigh career consequences. These are not theoretical concerns. Advocates note instances where service members cited subtle forms of professional pushback even after acting within new rules. The law sets ground cover, it does not guarantee safety. The presence of these protections nonetheless alters the balance of testimony. For much of the 20th century, stories about crash retrievals or anomalous craft remained confined to anonymous leaks or retired officers speaking long after leaving service. Now, in theory, those with decades of direct program involvement could brief committees while still active, providing contemporaneous accounts instead of filtered memories. Legislators themselves pointed out this advantage: more verifiable testimony, fewer ghost stories. For oversight institutions, this is a significant recalibration. Of course, critics remain skeptical. Some worry that new protections might encourage exaggeration, knowing that whistleblowers are less likely to face immediate dismissal or legal sanction. Others argue lawmakers are diverting resources toward what they still view as fringe ideas, distracting from more pressing defense needs. Yet the fact remains that legislative frameworks now exist. UAP testimony is no longer limited to the fringes of public debate. For Congress, once a venue that brushed aside such matters, the process of hearing and evaluating these accounts is now routine. The act of listening has itself legitimized the record. The contrast to the past is striking. Well into the late 20th century, insiders who spoke out often disappeared into public obscurity, their accounts surviving only in scattered publications or radio interviews. Today, the same categories of claims, no matter how controversial, enter into official transcripts and closed session notes. Even skeptics acknowledge that this represents a structural break from decades of blanket denial. Whatever one thinks of the claims themselves, the government has given them a formal path. The stakes are considerable. If an aerospace engineer reports exposure to unfamiliar materials, protections now allow presenting that information to oversight without immediately sacrificing a career. If an intelligence officer claims knowledge of programs involving unusual craft under custody, mechanisms exist to record and examine the account. These steps do not resolve questions of truth or verification, but they alter the ground rules of disclosure. Instead of shaping narratives through leaks and rumor, testimony is captured within legal frameworks, documented for potential follow-up. In effect, Congress has taken away secrecy's easiest weapon, fear of reprisal as a deterrent, yet it has not transformed whistleblowing into a risk-free endeavor. Careers, reputations, and relationships still hang in the balance for those who step forward. The outcome is a hybrid environment, safer than before, but never entirely secure. That middle ground is where the debate now sits, as leaders decide whether testimony is credible enough to drive further investigation. What matters most is that insiders today face a different calculation than at any point in recent history. Retaliation remains possible, but doors once welded shut are now at least partly open. Claims about UAPs can leave the margins and enter the official record. That transformation in turn set the stage for another practical shift. Lawmakers were no longer content with hearings and legal scaffolding alone. They were prepared to invest tangible support and resources into the issue. What Congress is funding in 2025. In 2025, lawmakers have moved beyond hearings and testimony by committing actual funding to the UAP issue. Instead of assigning staff to temporary reviews, Congress is writing allocations into Appropriations and defense authorization, ensuring the subject is addressed within the machinery of government. This is not a single earmark labeled crash retrievals, but a broad set of budget lines directed to oversight bodies, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, archival review projects, and laboratory access for testing reported materials. Funding is now part of the baseline conversation, a structural presence rather than a passing discussion. AARO alone has been processing hundreds of new reports, with the office publicly noting that between mid-2023 and mid-2024, It received about 757 fresh incident cases and had reviewed over 1,600 in total by the end of 2024. Those figures underline why Congress sees the need for resources. The volume is no longer negligible. This approach reflects a shift in tone. For years, the idea of UFO investigations in federal budgets seemed unthinkable. Now, appropriations create the backbone for methodical review, moving the subject out of speculative space and into institutional processes. Legislative amendments over 2023 and 2024, including UAP-related provisions attached to the NDAA and even elements of the UAP Disclosure Act language, reinforced this by requiring agencies to preserve records, review classified holdings, and standardize reporting. In practice, this means Congress is not funding a confirmed crash program, but is instead channeling money to the infrastructure that could verify or disprove such claims through proper oversight and science. Part of that infrastructure lies in analysis. Select laboratories with high security clearance and material science expertise are being granted funding to examine candidate samples reportedly linked to UAP sightings or incidents. The mandate is straightforward. Take what has until now circulated as extraordinary claims and subject it to empirical testing with advanced tools like isotopic analysis and nanostructure spectroscopy. Parliamentarians stress that this investment is less about confirming mythology and more about generating hard data. If unusual alloys or isotope ratios emerge, they can be documented. If nothing remarkable is found, the record is equally valuable for closing claims. Lawmakers also defend this spending by pointing out that material analysis can benefit aerospace and defense research regardless of outcome. Access to such labs remains tightly controlled, though, and the classification of potential samples continues to limit transparency. In parallel, Congressional Appropriations are supporting archival research and declassification projects. Large portions of mid-20th century defense files remain scattered or sealed, with interagency competition keeping them locked away. Funding in 2025 is enabling cleared staff to consolidate and review those archives to determine whether references to unusual materials or recovery operations appear in procurement records, contracts, or program ledgers. Unlike the ad hoc efforts of journalists or private researchers, this process is systematic and government-backed. The task is considerable, decades of files must be compiled, but the work is underway in a way it never consistently was before. The significance of attaching funds is straightforward. It builds continuity. When appropriations exist, staff are obligated to dedicate time, file progress reports, and keep offices active. This injects stability into what was once a volatile, media-driven debate. Investigations that might previously have faded within months are now structured as multi-year efforts with resources behind them. Skeptics in Washington acknowledge that whether the results vindicate or debunk sensational claims, the institutional process itself has expanded. The subject is no longer episodic. Still, funding the issue has not come without contest. Critics inside and outside Congress warn that appropriations represent a misallocation. Commentators emphasize that UFO inquiries have a record of yielding little definitive evidence despite decades of attention. Some argue that scarce defense dollars should flow to established threats like cyber warfare, hypersonic weapons, or missile defense rather than what they describe as fringe topics. Opinion editorials and budget watchdogs echo this, warning oversight could transform into expensive wheels spinning with few practical gains. Lawmakers counter that ignoring the possibility of advanced technology in U.S. custody might itself be irresponsible if testimonies prove valid. The eruption of debate reflects how UAPs have entered the mainstream of policy disputes once reserved for conventional security matters. In weighing these disagreements, congressional leaders have attempted to reframe funding rationales. Appropriations are emphasized not as money for flying saucers, but as investments in aerospace safety, airspace monitoring, and the proper handling of unidentified activity near sensitive facilities. Framed this way, budget lines become components of national security policy. Similarly, as seen with laboratory testing, the outputs are defined as dual use, insights that bolster broader defense research even if exotic origins are never validated. These arguments are presented as pragmatic, with leaders noting that the dollars involved remain a small fraction of the massive defense budget as a whole. What makes 2025 stand apart is less the scale of the money than its intent. For the first time, UAP oversight has an enduring budget rubric behind it. Offices like AARO are now fully funded to continue case review, incident logging, and coordination with agencies, rather than operating on minimal interim resources. Oversight committees can assign professional staff specifically to monitor compliance and track disclosures. Archival declassification can proceed systematically rather than as discretionary gestures. These mechanisms knit together a process that can outlast individual political cycles. The impact is already visible in congressional reports. Committees now receive scheduled updates on how AARO is progressing, how many cases have been logged, and how archival review is proceeding. These deliverables mean the issue cannot easily vanish when news interest declines. The bureaucratic pipeline forces consistent attention. Importantly, this does not resolve whether extraordinary claims, recovered craft, or non-human technology will ever be substantiated. But it does mean any such claims are being subjected to a more serious form of institutional testing than in the past. For advocates of disclosure, that is progress. For budget skeptics, it is costly repetition of experiments that history suggests will produce little. Regardless of perspective, the fact remains that governmental resources are now tied to an issue once ignored. That shift produces tangible outcomes. Archival records are being cataloged, laboratories are equipped to test unusual samples, and AARO is processing hundreds of incidents under sustained funding. Whether the ultimate findings affirm or dismiss the extraordinary rumors, the UAP question is set to produce a durable official archive rather than scattered anecdotes. There is, however, an unresolved tension underneath this new order. Public language in budgets emphasizes safety, oversight, and scientific evaluation, yet much of the testimony that spurred action focuses on deeper allegations that actual recovery programs have existed for decades. As appropriations fuel broader inquiries, attention turns toward whether any of these testimonies intersect with verifiable records of clandestine operations. The question is no longer whether Congress is taking action, but what those actions may ultimately unearth from the classified margins. The secretive crash retrieval programs. Among the most debated allegations in recent testimony are those of secretive crash retrieval programs. For years, stories of recovered wreckage, stored artifacts, and hidden projects circulated in speculation, but by 2025 they carry new weight because insiders with intelligence and military credentials have repeated them in official settings. Figures such as David Grusch and others have asserted that classified programs exist to recover and study what they describe as non-human technology. Yet against these claims stands a consistent public message from the Pentagon and the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. No verifiable evidence has been found to support assertions that the U.S. government or its contractors hold or are reverse engineering extraterrestrial materials. This tension between striking whistleblower testimony and firm official denial is what drives congressional interest. The allegations themselves follow a recognizable pattern. Witnesses say that, if crash retrievals have occurred, the materials were not necessarily stored inside government warehouses where oversight would be straightforward. Instead, they allege custody has sometimes fallen to defense contractors under specialized classified contracts. In this structure, compartmentalization makes tracing details difficult even for oversight personnel. Critics of secrecy argue this kind of contractor arrangement could explain how unusual programs might continue largely hidden, while skeptics maintain the lack of public documentation suggests misinterpretation or exaggeration. At present, these claims remain unverified. Congress has responded by directing inquiries into defense procurement records and contract trails to test whether such allegations withstand scrutiny. Another recurring point is the question of duration. Some insiders have suggested recovery operations may have been occurring for decades, stretching back into the mid-20th century. These statements are allegations, not documented history. They remain uncorroborated in the public record. Supporters of disclosure argue that secrecy over long spans would not be unprecedented, citing past concealed programs in nuclear weapons development or signals intelligence. Critics counter that the longer the claimed concealment, the less likely it would remain airtight. In either frame, Congress is now pressing the timeline issue, seeking to confirm or refute whether any recovery-related references survive in archived budget documents or legacy contracts. Lawmakers also recognize the implications if corporate custody is even partly accurate. If defense contractors, rather than government laboratories, held pieces of extraordinary material, then responsibility for access and use could sit with corporate executives and boards rather than elected leaders. This dynamic raises concerns about accountability and intellectual property. If hypothetically technologies from unusual artifacts were developed, what safeguards would exist to prevent them from being privatized rather than disclosed? Allegations of contractor custody therefore pose not only national security questions, but also legal and regulatory ones. Importantly, no specific contract names or corporate entities have been confirmed in public, which is why Congress has focused resources on combing through contract structures, non-disclosure agreements, and procurement ledgers. As multiple whistleblowers repeat similar themes, recovered craft, contractor involvement, compartmentalized programs, the impact is cumulative. A single testimony may appear speculative, but overlapping patterns invite closer inspection. Legislators have responded by asking investigative staff to look for hard indicators such as budget anomalies or procurement categories that might conceal extraordinary research projects. Legislative activity in 2023 and 2024 included directing the National Archives to centralize UAP-related records, creating a structured way to capture any archival evidence if it exists. These steps show that Congress intends to cross-check testimony with documentary trails, not just rely on verbal accounts. The implications of concealment, if substantiated, would be significant. Advocates argue that generations of scientists may have been unaware of data that could alter physics, propulsion, or materials engineering. If such materials exist and were withheld for decades, then the opportunity costs in scientific progress could be considerable. Critics, however, stress that nothing verifiable has yet surfaced. Unusual alloys or prototypes could just as easily originate from advanced human research programs kept classified in the ordinary course of defense development. The heart of the issue is whether oversight can separate misinterpretation from genuine extraordinary discovery. With legal protections for whistleblowers now in place, congressional hearings in 2025 are generating a steady flow of new testimony. Security-cleared witnesses are able to provide details in private, naming facilities, describing chains of custody, or outlining internal code names. While much of this still falls under classified review, the official recording of such testimony means that claims are no longer confined to rumor. They are subjects of legislative files and oversight records. Whether substantiated or refuted, they are at least being confronted in official forums. This process shifts attention from whether witnesses will come forward to how their information will be tested. Committees now seek not only stories but evidence, budget records, contract audits, and potential physical material. If any trail leads to verifiable findings, earlier denials will face challenge. If no supporting evidence is discovered, the record will still clarify what was reported and what remains unsupported. In either outcome, the structure of congressional inquiry ensures that crash retrieval programs are no longer just shadows on the periphery of debate, but entries in official proceedings. At this stage, the issue reduces to two possibilities. Either the allegations represent the most ambitious misinterpretation of classified defense research in modern history, or they point to programs that have deliberately withheld knowledge of non-human technology. Congress is not declaring either conclusion, but is building the process to establish which is closer to the truth. The combination of testimonies, budget tracing, and directed archival review demonstrates an unprecedented tilt toward resolution. That focus naturally leaves observers asking about the most tangible component. If artifacts were truly retrieved, what physical materials exist as proof? This is the question that pulls the discussion out of legal language and contractor contracts into the world of laboratories and data. It is where claims about unusual alloys, unexplained isotopes, and engineered objects intersect with the possibility of scientific verification, and where the boundary between allegation and evidence is most clearly tested. Material evidence and scientific analysis. If allegations of recovery programs are ever to move beyond testimony, the critical question becomes whether physical material exists that can withstand scientific scrutiny. Lawmakers and oversight offices know that fragments or engineered alloys would provide more decisive evidence than any hearing or declassified document. This is why in 2025, the emphasis has shifted strongly toward material evidence and independent analysis. The debate now centers on samples that whistleblowers describe as unusual, and on whether science can determine if they truly fall outside the thresholds of human manufacture. Accounts from insiders often reference candidate materials with properties that sound unconventional. Some speak of layered alloys with structures supposedly exceeding what manufacturing allowed in earlier decades. Others describe isotopic ratios that differ from those typically seen in natural terrestrial sources. Supporters of disclosure interpret such claims as indirect hints of non-human engineering. Scientists approach them cautiously. They acknowledge that if unusual layering or isotopic patterns are real, modern labs have the tools to measure them precisely. But they also point out that until those results appear in peer-reviewed studies, all such descriptions remain allegations rather than established fact. The central argument is not whether strange results are possible, they are, but whether the samples being discussed have been tested under transparent, repeatable conditions. Advocates highlight fragments allegedly showing high strength for very little weight, resistance to extreme heat, or electrical properties distinct from known conductors. These claims, if verified, would represent measurable differences in material behavior. At present, however, all they represent are observations attributed to unnamed insiders. This is where controlled laboratory analysis becomes essential. A fragment with verifiable data can move claims from narrative to reproducible fact. Congress has acknowledged this by allocating funds to equip laboratories with instrumentation capable of addressing origin questions. Spectrometry and electron microscopy can reveal the micro and nanostructures inside a sample. Isotopic analysis can identify whether the ratios of key elements align with natural terrestrial sources or deviate in ways that suggest artificial enrichment. These are precise, established scientific methods with clear standards of evidence. If tests reveal nothing extraordinary, the result adds clarity and reduces speculation. If anomalies are documented, the findings would demand follow-up and independent replication. Either way, the data set matters more than the story attached to it. History provides a note of caution. Many samples previously touted as exotic eventually proved to be common slag or industrial byproducts once examined more closely. A piece of manufactured metal can easily be mistaken for something mysterious if removed from its original context. Skeptics argue that the same cycle may be repeating now, claims inflated, attention fixed on anomalies, but destined to collapse once a thorough review is performed. Their point is that rigorous methods, not second-hand reports, must drive conclusions. Advocates of continuing research generally agree, without transparent testing, no path forward exists. This awareness is why 2025's funding carries symbolic and practical value. For the first time, taxpayer-backed laboratories are being tasked to take these fragments, whatever their origin, and submit them to peer-recognized methods of investigation. It creates the possibility of conclusive outcomes. False leads will be documented as such. Confirmed anomalies can be interrogated again and again until the explanation is clear. The credibility of the results rests not on rhetoric, but on whether they withstand repeated testing under open protocols. Supporters often point to the transformative potential if discoveries prove genuine, but framing such outcomes as certain risks overstating the case. A more careful perspective is appropriate. If materials could be shown to possess properties beyond known terrestrial manufacture, the potential scientific implications would be enormous. This explains why advocates push so strongly for independent analysis, not because breakthroughs are guaranteed, but because only systematic testing can clarify whether such potential even exists. From the standpoint of fairness, the use of classified channels in past decades has left open questions about access. If corporations or agencies have long studied unusual fragments under secrecy, then wider society has been excluded from potential technological advances. That concern makes congressional oversight critical. By placing materials in secure but officially accountable laboratories, lawmakers hope to ensure discoveries, if real, are treated as matters of public interest, not private enrichment. The stakes are scientific, but they are also social, deciding whether potentially novel knowledge remains confined or becomes broadly shared. For critics, the path forward is straightforward. Until samples are released for broad study and results make their way into peer-reviewed literature, the claims should remain labeled as unverified. They argue that public expectations should not be raised by speculation about revolutionary energy systems or propulsion concepts without first establishing that the materials themselves are extraordinary. In this sense, scientific caution and public responsibility align. What counts is evidence that anyone with proper access can confirm, not anecdotes that vary by source. This leaves the current moment in a state of balance. Lawmakers have created funding channels, scientists are preparing testing frameworks, and whistleblowers continue to describe fragments that deserve attention. What happens next will depend on whether samples actually appear in laboratories sanctioned to conduct deep analysis and whether any confirmable data emerges. The cycle of speculation will continue until results either rule out anomalies or verify phenomena requiring explanation. The issue illustrates how one object can influence the broader debate. Testimony may divide opinion, but a verified sample with unusual isotopic ratios or engineered microstructures could shift the discussion dramatically. Whether that occurs in 2025 remains unresolved, but what has changed is that processes and institutions now exist to test such claims under recognized standards. That structure alone marks a departure from earlier decades. As those investigations unfold, one point becomes clear. The search for material evidence is no longer just a domestic debate. Scientific testing in U.S. laboratories has become part of an international story, where other nations are beginning to confront the same questions and consider similar paths of inquiry. The stakes now extend beyond congressional hearing rooms and into the broader landscape of global disclosure. The global stage, other nations, and disclosure. In 2025, disclosure has shifted from a primarily American debate to one recognized on a wider political map. Governments outside the United States have begun to acknowledge the issue, sometimes by opening archives, sometimes by studying their own aviation data, and often under pressure from citizens demanding transparency. The subject is no longer contained within Washington's hearings or briefings. It has entered mainstream conversations in multiple countries, each adapting its response to domestic politics and strategic interests. One of the clearest examples comes from Canada. The Canadian government commissioned the Sky Canada project, which formally examined how the nation's federal institutions handled reports of anomalous aerial phenomena. After months of study, its report was published in 2025. The findings acknowledged that incidents had indeed been registered by pilots, radar operators, and law enforcement officers. The advisory recommended improvements to reporting pathways and greater interagency coordination. It also pointed out gaps in pilot self-reporting due to stigma, echoing many of the concerns raised in the United States. What made the Canadian report notable was that it set out practical changes for how agencies should log and evaluate unusual sightings, legitimizing the subject in a system that previously treated it as peripheral. France offers another long-standing example. Unlike many nations, France has had a government-sanctioned office dedicated to studying aerial anomalies for decades. Known as GIPAN and housed within the French space agency CNES, it investigates, reports, and publishes findings. Over time, GIPAN has amassed an archive of incidents, some with summaries suggesting a percentage remain unexplained. In recent years, as global attention increased, the office began releasing larger portions of its files online, confirming that France has monitored the question for a sustained period. These releases have not revealed definitive proof of extraordinary technology, but have made clear the degree of institutional tracking that has been underway, long before Washington's hearings reignited the topic. Beyond these examples, many nations in Europe, Latin America, and Asia have made portions of past archives available or have signaled intent to examine cases officially. National archives in multiple countries have uploaded formerly classified reports into public databases, showing that militaries and intelligence services across the world have logged UAP events for decades. Media outlets have amplified these disclosures, and international conferences now bring researchers and officials together to compare data sets. While each government moves at its own pace, the cumulative effect is momentum. UAP research and declassification, once highly fragmented, are now openly acknowledged as part of international policy discussions. This openness, however, is tempered by limits. Background research notes that while some governments emphasize transparency, others release only partial files, often with heavy redactions. Rivalries between states also complicate the picture. Analysts have suggested that while international scientific cooperation exists in some circles, geopolitical competition may dominate at the highest levels. If any exotic materials or technologies were truly at stake, states would not want to fall behind. Strategic and financial incentives inevitably shape disclosure decisions. Defense briefings have reinforced that some governments see the issue less as an abstract curiosity and more as a national security concern, where the possibility of advanced propulsion or sensor technology could disrupt future balance of power. This explains the guarded tone accompanying many archival releases, public enough to show responsiveness, restrained enough to preserve possible advantages. The pattern also reveals how global reactions diverge. In Canada and France, structured bureaucratic bodies manage reports in an explicit and procedural way. In other countries, governments simply declassify files in waves, allowing researchers to assess them without drawing attention to broader national policy. Across all of these examples, what unites them is the recognition that ignoring the subject entirely is no longer viable. Public opinion, pilot testimony, and persistent media coverage have anchored the issue too firmly for dismissal. Observers point out that this international scope underscores the need to separate narrative from measurable data. Just as in the United States, cases released abroad often divide into two categories: the majority, which yield conventional explanations once examined, and a smaller fraction that remain anomalous even after review. Those unresolved cases feed both curiosity and suspicion. They invite the possibility of shared research programs aimed at scientific investigation, but they also raise concerns. If verified anomalies emerge, who gets access to the results first and under what terms? What has changed most is perception. A decade ago, UAP conversations outside the United States often existed in cultural margins, alongside folklore or entertainment. By 2025, through official reports like Sky Canada's findings or GEIPAN's ongoing work, the matter is treated as one that governments must at least acknowledge. There is now precedent that whistleblower testimony, civilian reports, and pilot encounters can drive real institutional responses across borders. Part of the story is public reassurance, part is risk management, and part is geopolitical calculation. International competition adds an additional layer of complexity. Defense policy analysts note that breakthroughs in propulsion or sensor technology, if they actually existed, could reshape energy, surveillance, or aerospace industries globally. That possibility, even if only theoretical, ensures that disclosure conversations are shaped not simply by curiosity, but by strategic calculation. Governments monitor each other not only for transparency, but for advantage. The lack of clarity about how rivals interpret their findings increases mistrust. Some analysts caution that disclosure could become asymmetric, where certain states keep discoveries compartmentalized while others push for public transparency. What emerges is a picture of mixed motives. Transparency projects in Canada or Europe aim to normalize oversight and reduce stigma around reports. Simultaneously, the quiet posture of other governments implies they treat certain findings as security assets. International conferences and civil society networks may share data, but states themselves remain selective. This mixture of openness and secrecy is characteristic of how nations weigh both science and strategy in their responses. For citizens, the international steps taken so far suggest the phenomenon itself is not uniquely American. Reports arise across continents, and governments everywhere face the same pressure: explain the unknown and account for what occurs in protected skies. Yet explaining and verifying are different matters. Until definitive physical evidence is presented, most governments present their cases as transparency exercises rather than acknowledgments of extraordinary discovery. That balance, addressing public demand while holding back on firm conclusions, is the operative mode in 2025. As a result, the UAP debate now forms part of the broader world of geopolitics. Scientific institutions advocate for collaboration, but national security programs restrict access. Governments weigh potential social trust gains against possible strategic losses. This duality ensures that disclosure is not a uniform process but a patchwork, shaped by national priorities and international rivalry. These forces set the context for what comes next. Across countries, public accounts continue to rise, from pilots in commercial corridors to citizens watching skies in rural regions. Government infrastructures can release archives and convene boards, but the persistent reports themselves drive demand for explanation. And as the volume of those reports builds, nations everywhere must contend not only with secrecy in politics, but with the raw data continuing to accumulate year after year. Sightings surge and the 2025 numbers. In 2025, one measurable development in the UAP debate is the steady increase in reported sightings logged through official and civilian systems. Governments and private organizations now maintain databases that accept thousands of submissions, and the striking pattern is that reporting has risen sharply since the subject entered mainstream political debate in 2021. Agencies are now tasked full-time with examining whether these numbers reflect a genuine increase in unusual aerial activity or simply mirror improvements in reporting mechanisms, technology, and reduced stigma. The distinction matters because one explanation would indicate continuity, while the other could imply change in the skies. At present, the answer remains unsettled. Updated figures reveal the scale. The Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, reported that between May 2023 and June 2024, it had received 757 new incident reports, bringing its total reviewed cases to around 1,652. Of those, many were explained as balloons, drones, or atmospheric phenomena, but a meaningful share still lacked satisfactory resolution. Despite the addition of advanced sensors, expanded databases, and formalized reporting channels, these unresolved cases persist. In fact, the proportion of unexplained reports has not fallen over time, contradicting expectations that more precise tools would eliminate the unknowns. Instead, hundreds remain without prosaic explanation. This persistence is emphasized by a notable data point. In its 2024 public update, AARO's director identified roughly 21 cases that remained especially puzzling after analysis. These incidents did not conform to expected patterns of natural events or conventional aircraft and were considered to merit deeper study. For officials and analysts, this example reinforces the broader picture. Improved systems are indeed filtering out false positives, but even after that process, anomalies still endure. The numbers themselves do not demonstrate what the anomalies are, only that they have not been dismissed by default. The distribution of reports shows how diverse the witness base has become. Military pilots continue to contribute some of the most heavily documented cases, usually including radar, infrared, or optical data. Commercial pilots form another important group, offering detailed testimony based on professional training and hours of direct observation. Radar operators, both civilian and military, provide independent datasets that register untracked movements inconsistent with known traffic. And ordinary citizens report sightings supported by smartphone recordings, flight tracking apps, or even automated cameras, feeding a secondary layer of evidence into national databases. Together, these four groups illustrate the deployment of both professional and public perspectives in building the modern record. Much of the rise can be traced to the normalization of reporting. Historically, both pilots and radar operators hesitated to file, worried about stigma or professional damage. In the post-2021 climate, congressional hearings and institutional guidance have stressed that reports will be taken seriously and handled without ridicule. As a result, both civilian and military channels now record far more data than before. These new procedures have reduced the attrition of cases lost to silence or embarrassment, creating a more accurate sense of incident frequency. That increase in transparency also helps explain why the overall volume appears higher in recent years. Technology contributes as well. Modern radar and tracking systems are now sensitive enough to detect very small, low observability craft moving in unusual ways. Systems designed to monitor drones or hypersonic weapons also pick up signatures that evade conventional categories. At the same time, ordinary citizens carry powerful mobile phones capable of recording high-definition video and geolocation data. Taken together, these advances reduce reliance on memory alone and preserve details that earlier generations could not. Because of these gains in both reporting and detection, activity that once went unnoticed is now entering the official record in much greater volume. The policy impact is straightforward. Unresolved cases represent more than just scientific curiosity. They raise practical safety issues. Aviation authorities cannot ignore reports of unidentified objects near civilian flight paths, especially when pilots describe near collisions or sudden intrusions at cruising altitude. Regardless of whether the cause is misidentification, foreign technology, or something still unknown, air safety requires documentation and assessment. This pragmatic concern has driven legislation and expanded agency roles as much as the more speculative side of the debate. It is one reason why countries beyond the United States have also sought structured reporting programs of their own. At the same time, the unresolved numbers fuel public and political pressure. If technology and improved systems had reduced unknowns to near zero, skeptics would likely call for scaling back attention. Instead, the opposite has occurred. Greater precision has preserved a significant category of unexplained events, suggesting that something warrants continuing scrutiny. While the content of those cases is debated, the persistence of unexplained anomalies ensures that congressional committees, scientific researchers, and advocacy groups all remain engaged. Numbers also affect perception. As AARO and allied organizations confirm possession of unresolved cases, public audiences interpret that as evidence of a deeper mystery. Officials carefully stress that unresolved does not equal extraordinary, yet simply acknowledging that dozens remain puzzles keeps the subject alive. Legislators, pressed by constituents, point to such statistics as justification for ongoing investigation. The figures therefore act as both data for analysts and signals of credibility for the wider population. Still, context remains crucial. The rise in reports may not reflect an increase in frequency of unusual craft. It may instead show improved willingness to file, better sensors, and broader databases. Both possibilities are consistent with current numbers, and separating them will require years of comparative analysis. That ambiguity means authorities face two parallel tasks: refining tools to explain what they can, while carefully managing expectations about what unresolved really means. Neither the surge nor the persistence of unknowns automatically validates extraordinary conclusions, but both force continued engagement. The pattern demonstrates how the UAP issue has shifted from folklore into a documented area with measurable statistics. Hundreds of newly registered reports, dozens still without explanation after analysis, and at least a small group flagged by officials as especially unusual. All of these details generate formal momentum. Where anecdote once dominated, databases now lead. Where silence once prevailed, testimony now accumulates. This is the environment in which debates about authenticity and interpretation unfold in 2025. Officials and the public now face the challenge of interpretation. What conclusions should be drawn from rising totals? Are these the result of better collection, or do they hint at something genuinely new? Such questions support the institutional momentum for continued hearings, public briefings, and scientific engagement. Yet alongside this expansion, another voice has grown equally prominent. Critics who argue that the numbers prove little, that censor errors and bias persist, and that funding for UAP scrutiny should remain limited. Their response forms the counterweight to every disclosure claim, shaping how the narrative is understood in government and among the public. Skeptics, debunkers, and the pushback. Skepticism remains one of the strongest forces shaping how UAP claims are judged. For every new testimony, censor report, or congressional briefing, there are scientists, officials, and policymakers who insist that evidence must meet the same standards as any other scientific claim. Extraordinary conclusions, they argue, demand extraordinary proof, and that means physical samples confirmed through transparent testing and results that survive peer review. Until such data is produced, skeptics maintain the conversation should stay anchored to conventional explanations. This does not mean dismissal of the phenomenon outright. Many skeptics acknowledge unusual cases exist, but resist leaps to non-human origins without testable, verifiable data in the public record. One of the central points skeptics emphasize is the reliability of instrumentation. Modern tactical aircraft and ground systems capture radar, infrared, and optical readings with unprecedented sensitivity, yet no system is free from limitations. Radar can generate false echoes under specific atmospheric conditions. Infrared sensors can misinterpret heat signatures distorted by the environment, and optical recordings can mislead without clear scale or points of reference. Reports that cite unusual sensor returns, in the skeptical view, cannot stand as proof of extraordinary craft. NASA's own 2023 UAP study team stressed this point as well, concluding that better, high-quality, multi-sensor datasets are needed because single instrument readings often produce ambiguous results. Supporters of disclosure may see sensor anomalies as the mark of something profound, but skeptics underline that anomalies are just as often the result of error, calibration issues, or interpretation gaps. Human observation presents similar complications. Even highly trained pilots and radar operators are not immune to cognitive limits. Under stress, unusual light angles, rapid motion, or reflections can produce images that appear structured or mechanical when in reality they are atmospheric effects. Skeptics do not question the sincerity of such testimony. Rather, they point out that sincerity is not the same as accuracy. An experienced aviator may honestly describe what they perceive, but even expert eyes can produce mistaken impressions when faced with incomplete information. For critics of extraordinary claims, this reinforces why independent and instrument-based data are essential for confirmation. Cultural expectation also shapes interpretation. People are conditioned by decades of media to associate unexplained lights or fast-moving objects with advanced craft. Psychological studies show how perception can be influenced by familiar stories. Gaps are filled in with what is already culturally resonant. Skeptics often compress this point into one principle: expectations nudge interpretation. Because of this, they argue independent measurements and corroboration across multiple sensors are decisive in separating perception from reality. Political skeptics often frame the issue in terms of costs. Legislators who oppose allocating money to crash retrieval investigations or material testing argue those resources belong to pressing needs such as defense modernization, social programs, or cyber warfare. To them, setting aside defense dollars for UAP research looks like indulging speculation at taxpayer expense. Appropriations for AARO and related programs have fueled editorials calling these projects distractions from urgent priorities. For this camp, every dollar spent on unexplained reports could otherwise fund missions with concrete outcomes. Scientists in the skeptical community argue from procedural norms. In physics, materials science, and engineering, discoveries only gain credibility when replicated and challenged in open journals. So far, skeptics note, no fragment claimed to be extraordinary has survived that scrutiny. while whistleblowers and advocates circulate accounts of unusual isotopic ratios or exotic alloys, the absence of peer-reviewed publication is decisive. Without studies open to replication, skeptics say nothing has advanced beyond claims. Their position is pragmatic. Until data can be shared and retested transparently, it belongs to speculation, not science. Official bodies reinforce this cautious stance. AARO has made repeated public statements that it has found no verifiable evidence of extraterrestrial material or reverse-engineered craft. Senior Defense Department leaders echo this position, stating that so far nothing in the record supports extraordinary interpretations. These views function as the formal institutional counterweight. While whistleblowers urge that programs exist, the agencies tasked with oversight continue to report otherwise. For skeptics, this underlines their point. Official investigations have not yet uncovered data to support the most dramatic allegations. Importantly, not all skeptics reject UAP inquiry as pointless. Some argue that studying anomalies, even if they prove mundane, can benefit aerospace research. Reviewing flight data, improving sensor fidelity, and collecting pilot reports with discipline might lead to advancements in detection technologies or safety protocols. Their objection is not to studying unknowns, but to conflating every unexplained signature with non-human origins. They call for methodical exploration of raw data without framing conclusions prematurely. Others take a harder line, seeing the UAP surge as a byproduct of cultural fascination amplified by political theater. From this perspective, congressional hearings and whistleblower testimonials are more about public spectacle than hidden truths. In their view, the subject is magnified by opportunism. They contrast decades of extraordinary claims with the persistent absence of definitive proof as evidence that nothing fundamentally new exists behind the headlines. This divide results in a clash of worldviews. Opponents see mounting testimony and unresolved censor cases as momentum toward disclosure. Skeptics view each unexplained case as awaiting mundane resolution once enough data appears. The arguments have been in circulation for decades, but what makes 2025 distinctive is that official institutions are not ignoring the matter. They are funding research, archiving records, and holding hearings. Enthusiasts interpret that as validation. Skeptics interpret it as misplaced attention granted to the fringes. Yet skepticism plays a deeper role than just disagreement. It enforces standards of proof and ensures that evidence is tested rather than accepted on faith. Skeptics remind the public and policymakers that without peer review and verifiable material data, stories cannot convert into knowledge. They push back at leaps to conclusions and demand consistency with how other scientific claims are handled. This pressure does not end the controversy, it prolongs it. But it helps provide a counterbalance that prevents premature consensus around extraordinary interpretations. The net result is friction but also dialogue. Believers point to whistleblower protections, appropriations, and global reporting as proof disclosure is underway. Skeptics counter with the absence of replicable data, censor ambiguity, and official denials. The two camps rarely change each other's minds, yet the tension itself has become the structure of the debate. Every incident, report, or hearing is filtered through these opposing interpretations, ensuring ongoing contest rather than closure. This continuing divide leaves a larger question hanging just beyond the clash of evidence and counter-evidence. If no conclusive data has been made public, yet so much energy is devoted to secrecy, testimony, and oversight, then why does the issue persist at such intensity? Skeptics press for proof, believers insist more is hidden, and officials walk a cautious line between them. What lingers unresolved is a harder question. Why would matters of this scale be concealed at all? That question rises repeatedly in the debate and forms the foundation of the next challenge addressed inside government and outside it: the motivations behind hiding such information in the first place. Behind the curtain, motivations for secrecy. Behind every argument about sightings or whistleblower claims lies a harder question. Why would governments invest such effort into keeping certain information hidden? In debates about UAPs, secrecy itself becomes the focus. Some whistleblowers assert that concealment has extended across decades, while historians note the United States has a long record of compartmentalizing advanced programs under strict classification, from Cold War reconnaissance projects like the U-2 to the nuclear programs of the mid-20th century. The continuation of that pattern offers one plausible explanation for how secrecy in the UAP arena could persist across so many years. Among the most frequently cited motives is national security. If unfamiliar craft or unusual materials were actually in custody, they would not first be evaluated for public science but for potential defense applications. History shows how consistently governments act this way. Nuclear research, early satellite surveillance, and stealth aviation technologies were all developed in secrecy to preserve advantage against rivals. Under the same logic, any extraordinary discovery, whether recovered intact or only fragmentary, would be shielded from public disclosure until military implications could be understood. Officials warned that admitting possession without full comprehension could encourage adversaries to accelerate searches of their own, complicating strategic balance. In this frame, classification is less about hiding the existence of phenomena from citizens than about standard military caution. A related explanation focuses on misidentification of classified projects. Pentagon officials, including former AARO Director Sean Kirkpatrick, have stated on record that some UAP narratives appear to derive from sightings of secret defense prototypes or from inadvertent leaks about classified developments. In these cases, keeping a tight lid serves to protect not exotic craft but existing national security programs with legitimate need for secrecy. From this perspective, the persistence of UAP rumors may reflect layers of misinterpretation. Witnesses describe something unfamiliar, but what they observed belongs to a human program they lacked clearance to know existed. Critics of disclosure argue that conflating these sightings with extraterrestrial theories risks revealing sensitive defense programs rather than uncovering alien technology. Economic impact is another angle. Though often speculative, the core concern is straightforward. If revolutionary technologies existed and were suddenly made public, they could upend entire global industries. Energy, aerospace, and shipping all rest on systems designed around 20th century technologies. Propulsion or energy source that undercut these foundations could unravel markets overnight. Policymakers worry that such disruption might produce financial chaos before societies could adapt. Proponents of keeping discoveries classified argue secrecy protects from destabilization. Critics counter that it permits corporations or small groups with access to monopolize potential advances, reserving benefits for themselves. Regardless of interpretation, the economic motive surfaces in many discussions but is inevitably difficult to confirm in practice. Another consistent theme is institutional habit. Agencies accustomed to secrecy do not easily shed that culture. During the Cold War, surveillance and weapons programs were reflexively classified, sometimes long after their need for protection diminished. Declassification often trails decades behind events. Viewed in this light, UAP secrecy may partly emerge from bureaucracy's default reflex: hide first, process later, disclose rarely. Even when risks are small, classification persists because institutions are trained to err on the side of restriction. What began as Cold War caution remains embedded in agency culture today. Critics note that this mindset can explain the endurance of secrecy without needing deliberate conspiracy. It is a structural tendency rather than a single coordinated decision. Social stability provides another line of reasoning. Leaders throughout the 20th century often voiced concern that admitting the presence of unknown craft might provoke fear or disorientation among the public. Some scholars argue that religious, scientific, or political institutions were thought too fragile to handle such revelations without loss of legitimacy. That concern may have been exaggerated, but it formed part of the justification for withholding information. In this interpretation, secrecy was framed as protective, a paternalistic measure intended to preserve public trust in governance. Opponents argue that society is more resilient than such officials allowed, but the rationale itself remains part of the historical record. Secrecy also reflects the principle that information is power. Whether the motive is protecting defense research, safeguarding industries, or maintaining authority, the underlying logic is consistent. Restricting access grants control over outcomes. This mirrors how governments have handled countless other sensitive programs, from code breaking in wartime to modern surveillance technologies. UAP-related secrecy, if it follows that tradition, would not represent a unique anomaly, but an application of an established principle used whenever information carries strategic weight. Supporters of stronger disclosure legislation argue that keeping this particular subject locked away undermines democratic accountability, but they acknowledge its consistency with conventional information management. Balanced against these motives are the criticisms they invite. Skeptics of official narratives argue that secrecy too easily masks abuses of power, and that labeling everything national security allows programs to escape oversight. Advocates for disclosure point out that scientists outside classified environments are denied access to potentially valuable knowledge, and that the public shoulders funding for projects it cannot examine. The counter-argument is that secrecy may protect both program integrity and public safety, at least until knowledge is better understood. This tension underscores the contested nature of the debate, Both sides claim to defend stability, but they disagree on whom secrecy actually serves. What emerges is a spectrum of possible explanations, not a single proven answer. National security caution, misidentification of classified projects, concerns over disruptive economic impacts, institutional reflexes, and protection of public stability all surface as plausible motives. Some explanations emphasize prudence, others emphasize protection of power. Historical comparisons from Manhattan Project secrecy to the concealment of reconnaissance platforms show that compartmentalization itself is hardly unusual. Whether or not UAP claims stand apart depends less on the principle of secrecy than on what, if anything, the programs actually contain. Regardless of origin, these habits of concealment shape consequences beyond policy calculation. When secrecy becomes the default, it influences how insiders behave, how whistleblowers are treated, and how credibility circulates inside government and outside it. The structures built to suppress information about UAPs may serve other functions too, but in practice they directly affect individuals' careers and lives. That dimension often receives less attention than geopolitics or economics, but it remains just as significant, and it is here that the story of secrecy reveals its most immediate and personal costs. The human cost of the cover-up. For all the attention placed on programs, secrecy, and politics, the most lasting consequences are lived by the individuals who chose to speak. The human cost of the cover-up is measured not in documents or hearings, but in damaged lives, strained families, and careers halted at their peak. For decades, people have weighed the choice between silence and the risks of disclosure, and many who stepped forward bear scars that never fully fade. Whistleblowers themselves have described this environment repeatedly. Some reported being warned not to discuss their knowledge again. Others documented losing security clearances or being reassigned out of meaningful work, sanctions that did not need to be explained because the message was obvious. Formal complaints such as those filed by David Grusch include references to professional retaliation and psychological stress, illustrating that reprisals are not only alleged but documented in official channels. In cultures engineered for secrecy, even raising questions quietly could prompt isolation within an office, with colleagues suddenly treating once trusted peers as potential liabilities. Reputation damage inside closed systems can end a career more effectively than any formal dismissal. The effects rarely stopped at the classified level. For professional insiders who decided to leave and speak openly, their reputations often followed them into the civilian world. Background checks, references, and quiet evaluations from contractors can spread quickly in defense-oriented industries. Once someone becomes identified as difficult or unreliable for breaching norms of silence, consulting firms and aerospace companies are reluctant to hire them. Whistleblowers across multiple decades have explained how postings in industry were suddenly pulled back after records of their testimony surfaced. Skills earned from years of service in technical or military roles became irrelevant against the stigma of challenging secrecy. The burden extended to family life. Spouses and children carried the stress of financial loss and public skepticism. Neighbors sometimes whispered about their relatives' sudden notoriety, and friendships dissolved under the weight of unwanted publicity. Families described tension escalating into estrangement as money dwindled and emotional pressure grew. What began as a professional decision rippled through daily existence, leaving ordinary lives fractured. Some whistleblowers have also made claims about threatening incidents and physical risks linked to their disclosures or work. A few alleged being told that consequences awaited if they revealed names, details, or physical evidence. Still others have claimed health ailments from unusual material exposures during contract assignments. These remain allegations, unverified in public records and undocumented outside testimony. Yet even with that caveat, the stories echo a powerful message. Those who participated in compartmentalized programs sometimes believe they exposed themselves not simply to risk of censure, but to personal danger. Whether that danger came from human retaliation or environmental hazard, it is described as real in those accounts. Beyond external threats lies the internal strain. Testifying in hearings or interviews is only part of the story. For many insiders, years of silence carried their own costs: sleepless nights, anxiety, stress-induced illness, and the constant feeling of carrying knowledge they believed should not remain hidden. Public interviews and even open testimony in 2023 included first-hand descriptions of whistleblowers experiencing emotional breakdowns or long-term stress caused by keeping secrets. This psychological burden underscores that even those who never spoke out still paid. The cover-up for them was lived every day inside their own minds. Condensing the consequences as experienced makes the toll clearer. Professionally, many whistleblowers lost clearances, faced stalled careers, or watched once promising opportunities vanish after speaking about UAP-related matters. Personally, families carried the strain as financial security collapsed and reputations drew attention and suspicion from communities. Health-wise, whistleblowers themselves have described stress-related illness, depression, and in some testimonial cases, exposure-related symptoms, conditions reported in media interviews but not independently confirmed. These three categories define the recurring costs of silence or disclosure. By 2025, new protections written into law have encouraged more figures to step forward despite those risks. Legal cover may reduce official retaliation, but it does not erase reputational damage or guarantee that industries will open their doors. Whistleblowers appearing before oversight panels have described their decision as one of necessity, saying they felt compelled to act regardless of outcome. For some, the legal protections introduced in 2023-2024 provided the minimal assurance needed to make that choice in public. For others, the pressure of holding knowledge outweighed fear itself. Either way, testimony continues, proving that even when history shows the painful costs, some people still decide disclosure is worth more than silence. Observers note that sacrifice itself communicates significance. Careers are not surrendered lightly, nor are reputations risked for stories the witness does not believe. People testifying under conditions that bring scrutiny to their families and livelihoods signal conviction that the matter they describe overshadows their own welfare. Whether their accounts ultimately prove accurate or not, their choices remind the public that these are not casual rumors passed across dinner tables. They represent decisions to abandon stability, security, and social standing. For those skeptical of UAP testimony, this human cost adds a layer of context that cannot be ignored. It may not validate the substance of crash retrieval allegations or exotic material claims, but it confirms the consequences of speaking out. People have lost income, faced intimidation, and lived with psychological strain after raising the subject. The existence of those outcomes is not theoretical. They have been recorded through accounts, media coverage, and official filings. The secrecy, in other words, is not intangible. It manifests directly in human consequences. Hearings in 2025 continue to magnify these realities. Each new voice adds to the collective record of sacrifice. Some whistleblowers put their names on the record, others present their testimony under classified protection. Still others remain silent, watching to see what happens to their colleagues before deciding whether to step forward. Together, they form a picture not only of secrecy, but of how secrecy reshapes individual lives. Beyond the documents and beyond the archivists, the cover-up's immediate effect has always been felt most sharply by those pushed to its margins. This perspective deepens the stakes. Secrecy is not harmless withholding of information until a safer day. It is a system that constrains individuals, isolates families, and erodes careers. By 2025, the evidence of that toll has become part of the official record, not in laboratory results or radar logs, but in the lives of whistleblowers whose testimony is accompanied by visible personal consequence. That reality has driven both lawmakers and advocacy groups to create legal corridors, arguing that protections are owed precisely because costs have been so evident. The story of the cover-up is thus inseparable from the story of the people who spoke out. Their decisions demonstrate what secrecy demands, who pays for it, and what is lost in the process. With every hearing, more of those costs move from rumor to visible record. It is those sacrifices that explain why the debate carries urgency into the present. These consequences, accumulated year after year, form part of the reason oversight committees say the UAP issue can no longer languish as speculation alone. The human costs have made the stakes inescapable, and they press the question of how long secrecy can be sustained before lawmakers and the public demand something different. Where the disclosure movement is headed. After years of secrecy bearing heavy personal costs, the next question is simple. Where does the disclosure movement go from here? 2025 marks a decisive moment. UAPs are no longer confined to late-night speculation, but occupy space in hearings, appropriations, and scientific debate. The movement now faces diverging paths, each shaped by political mechanisms already in motion. Inside Congress, pressure builds through legislation. Multiple proposals tied to the UAP Disclosure Act sought to create new pathways for declassification, while Senate amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act established requirements for preserving and reviewing historical records. By 2024, a new UAP records collection was mandated within the National Archives, setting up a process to consolidate federal materials and provide structured timelines for disclosure. These measures demonstrate that formal levers exist, but their use depends on whether lawmakers favor public transparency or defer to agency caution. Scientists remain focused on one critical demand: material access. For decades, they have argued that claims of exotic fragments can only be settled with transparent, peer-reviewed analysis. Formal petitions now pressure Congress to direct testing outside classified labs. To researchers, denial of access is less about security than obstruction. With labs equipped to perform isotopic and structural testing, the scientific community insists that dismissing their role perpetuates uncertainty rather than resolving it. The pressure adds a measured but unavoidable dimension. Unless science is allowed independent access, speculation will persist regardless of government statements. Public opinion is the third force. Citizens across polls express deep skepticism toward official narratives and call for accountability after generations of denial. For some, new hearings and mandates mark progress. For others, they resemble carefully managed releases designed to stretch transparency without yielding its substance. In 2025, the disclosure movement speaks not only to the presence or absence of unusual craft, but to the larger question of whether institutions can rebuild trust with their citizens. Openness signals legitimacy, withholding fuels suspicion. That calculation drives pressure as much as curiosity itself. The future of disclosure can therefore be framed through three clear scenarios. The first is broader transparency, driven by congressional declassification orders, laboratory access, and sustained oversight. In this path, legislation compels release of historical files and ensures that scientists test reported materials independently. Even skeptics acknowledge that such openness would close myths by either disproving them directly or providing data robust enough to confirm anomalies. The second scenario is compartmentalization, where resistance inside agencies narrows the process to piecemeal, selective releases. Testimonies continue, few records trickle out, but substantive files and materials remain beyond reach. This reflects the entrenched method of secrecy used for decades, concedes small disclosures under public pressure while preserving the crucial data in classification. For critics, this outcome would replicate the last 70 years, anticipation followed by withholding. The third scenario is international cascade, triggered if other nations advance disclosure more quickly than the United States. Canada's Sky Canada report and France's GIPAN program already set frameworks. If rivals open significant archives or release physical data first, Washington may be forced to follow, if only to retain credibility or avoid perception of lagging behind. International competition could accelerate information sharing, or could cause governments to double down in secrecy, ensuring rivals cannot gain perceived advantage. Each of these possibilities is tethered to concrete mechanisms. Broader transparency would rely on Congress enforcing provisions like the NDAA mandates for archival disclosure. Continued compartmentalization would come from agency resistance, where classification policies override intent behind legislation. An international cascade would develop from policy moves abroad, particularly if one major power introduces UAP reporting or material study findings in ways that capture global attention. In each case, the outcome is less mythical than procedural, determined by how specific institutions act on existing levers. What is certain is the unprecedented visibility of the conflict. Hearings are televised, scientists submit public petitions, journalists question senior lawmakers directly about UAP initiatives. The curtain, once heavy and opaque, has been pulled back enough for citizens to watch the machinery grind in real time. That visibility has made the disclosure movement harder to dismiss. Even without extraordinary revelations, the subject has become entwined with discussions of transparency, oversight, and how democratic institutions handle contested knowledge. Still, the prospect of another stalemate looms. If resistance persists, the cycle of anticipation and secrecy could repeat once again. Advocates stress that without follow-through, release of material to independent study, systematic declassification, structured reporting, the 2025 reforms risk becoming symbolic gestures. Skeptics counter that reforms are already sufficient and that pursuing extraordinary claims further invites waste or misinterpretation. The clash between these positions defines the fragile balance of this moment. For viewers following the story, the most practical indicator will be legislative progress. Watch for whether committees strengthen the National Archives' disclosure role, whether appropriations continue to equip laboratories for testing, and whether upcoming NDAA cycles expand or contract transparency provisions. These moves, far more than dramatic testimony or headlines, will decide the trajectory. Congress and classification policy remain the critical gatekeepers. Independent science access is the test of whether unprecedented claims will be verifiable. The disclosure movement's direction will be measured not in rhetoric, but in the mechanics of government. What role the public plays is simpler but vital. Sustained interest keeps the debate on the agenda. Lawmakers respond to constituents insisting on transparency. Scientists respond when research is funded and empowered. For the democracy under scrutiny, public engagement functions as the anchor holding this issue in view. At its simplest, the question to ask is, which outcome would you trust most, full transparency and independent access, staged releases over decades, or continued secrecy until further notice? Comment below with your perspective. Knowing where trust lies is itself a vital part of how this debate unfolds. The disclosure movement has therefore reached a hinge point defined by three scenarios, each buttressed by mechanisms already underway. Broader transparency, compartmentalization, or international cascade with framework comes next. Which prevails will depend less on declarations of belief than on legislation, classification authority, and scientific access. The stakes extend beyond question of anomalous craft, touching oversight, trust, and global competition. And from this landscape emerges a sharpened question that presses governments, scientists, and citizens alike. Will disclosure continue as a cautious process, or has it already entered an era where secrecy itself can no longer contain the issue? Disclosure now sits at the center of science, oversight, and politics. The rules of secrecy are shifting, and where this leads toward proof, toward more uncertainty, or back into silence depends on the legal, scientific, and political choices unfolding right now. Institutions face a decision: continue withholding or open pathways that allow evidence to be tested independently. For you, the most important step is to think critically, judge claims by what can be verified, not by spectacle. If you want to stay engaged, subscribe and share in the comments which piece of evidence you most want to see tested next.